that anger on those peregrines. Oh, let me just say I've got that. And another reason actually to consider, particularly in Scotland, and these are the breeding bird survey results for these Scottish birds actually since 1990s, are the fact that some of their prey species have been declining. So there's half the number of lapwings in Scotland, for example, since the 1995, and they are a common prey item of the peregrine falcon. So there's a whole mix of things really. There's kind of illegal persecution, there's change in habitats, less good quality habitat, and also a decline in prey species. But actually in urban locations, it's quite the opposite, really. Since their decline and since their recovery, really, they've suddenly changed their behavior from using coastal cliffs and very rural kind of rocky crags and actually come into inland quarries and urban locations and buildings. And so certainly across many, many parts of England, certainly where there's a city or a big town, and ideally a big office block or a cathedral or a very enthusiastic church spire, then peregrines are very commonly found these days and doing very well indeed. There's lots of food, there's lots of space for them, and also I'll come to this later, but there's the light at night time, which is also helping these birds to forage. So this is an interesting transition because these are actually some very young peregrine chicks in the Avon Gorge in Bristol. And if any of you know the Avon Gorge in Bristol, it's actually only about 3 miles from the centre of Bristol. It's just on that kind of transition between rural and suburban. And here actually is a juvenile peregrine in the Avon Gorge with the A4 portway just below. I love it because it's, to me, it's that kind of transition between the peregrine being this rural bird, but also becoming this or being this urban bird. And peregrines are very much at home in an urban environment. So here's a pair of peregrines quite happily mating, copulating on a building, for example, without any problem at all. And they don't really mind what we might regard as urban junk. So here we have a peregrine falcon quite happily on some telecommunications. And this is quite often where you might find the birds just hanging out. And this is one of my favorite images, actually. This is from Derby Cathedral, where a surveyor actually was up on the top of the building and looking down onto the peregrines well. This is a lovely little male peregrine. They've got a slightly sort of smaller head, squatter body, really, looking down onto the male peregrine's domain. You can just see a couple of people walking below. But actually, I know this from being on the roofs of different buildings before, particularly when I've been out looking at peregrines. It's a very quiet environment up high there, and the peregrine has got a really good kind of visual space to look for its prey. And one of the reasons why urban peregrines are doing so well also is that from about the late 90s, the 2000 onwards, people started to see peregrines using churches, using buildings, pairing up very often and showing mating behavior, but not really having somewhere to lay their eggs. And so many cities and towns, nest trays have been put up which have substrate on them, some sort of gravel, and that allows the peregrines then to actually lay their eggs on that gravel and in many cases successfully nest. And so one of the real reasons for their success has not just been their taste for urban locations, it's also been providing them with the right nesting places for them to actually lay their eggs. And this, for example, is a beautiful female peregrine on very young chicks that have just hatched in Cheltenham. And this is a great example, actually, because here the eggs were often rolling into the gutter. The peregrines had a lead roof, flat lead roof, and there was nowhere for their eggs to nestle into. So actually, Dave Pearce, who's one of the people that actually oversees the peregrines here, installed this wonderful box with gravel. And ever since then, the peregrines have been most years successfully nesting. And you can see just how delicate actually the peregrine is being here. And of course, one of the advantages of then having these nest cameras, like what you have in Sheffield, is that you can then install cameras and actually be able to watch the intimate lives of these birds in ways that actually rural peregrines never quite allowed us to do. So here we can see those same peregrine chicks, several weeks older now and growing very big. And you can see actually that the roof of this nest box also helps to sort of shelter the youngsters from the very hot sun. As peregrines have increased in our urban locations and some rural locations as well, it has given us the opportunity to get close to these birds, not only through webcams, but also through being able to ring these birds. And so many ringers now across the country are able to actually put metal ID rings and color ID rings on peregrine chicks when they're around about 3 weeks old. And some of you may well be watching who do actually get involved with this. It's often an occasion for some places, and other times it might well be photographed and shared between people. This actual peregrine chicken ring in here is actually on a cliff face by a railway very close to Bristol. But these birds often then venture into urban locations. And I think Anna's just joined us. Anna Field's just joined us as well, and she often, or most years, rings the Cheltenham peregrine chicks as well. And the idea of these colour rings is that they do enable us really to find out where these birds go. So those of you around the Sheffield and Rotherham, and if you're joining us from other parts of Northern England as well, you might well be familiar with seeing peregrines with orange rings, maybe sometimes red rings that have black lettering. The blue lettering tends to be birds that we ring around the West Country, around the sort of Bristol, Bath, Dorset and Devon areas. But in essence, really, because peregrines are very well observed and well loved birds, people often photograph them, they often observe them on web cameras, and often see them through telescopes and can read their rings, which enables us to then be able to follow the journeys of these birds and be able to find out more about their family history and where they've come from. So, for example, this bird here actually is a great example of a peregrine not going very far at all. This is AA. He was the first peregrine chick that I ringed back in 2007. And he actually stayed in Bath where he hatched. And he sadly died last year. He was found dead in Bath. Not any suspicious circumstances. He was 13 years old. And during that time had raised many, many chicks indeed. So, but it just shows you how even from a distance here, you can see AA very clearly on those rings. And these are some other birds of interest, actually. We've got one bird here that was ringed in Exeter, one that was ringed in Bath, and both of them are now actually the breeding pair in Taunton in Somerset. So here we have them as chicks on the right and then as adults on the left. And this map here shows you where many of our urban dwelling and some rural dwelling peregrines around the southwest of England do actually end up. And what's very interesting actually is that many of them do end up turning up in the Midlands and Northern England. We've got one, probably the longest travelled bird here is one that went from Exeter to Halifax. Now, we see a little bit of a gap in Wales, but that may simply be because there are not the people observing and seeing these birds on kind of rural rocky crags. But generally, the trend is that peregrines are moving northeast up your way, basically, towards, for those of you who are in the Sheffield and Rotherham area, peregrines from the southwest of England are moving into those vacant spaces. They're moving into those new areas where there may not be urban dwelling peregrines. And many of the birds that are doing this journey are female peregrines. So the male peregrines tend to stay closer to home. They may travel 30, 40, 50 miles, sometimes more. But most of these long journeys you're seeing on this map are females. And the females are doing this to be able to find new males who are of a different genetic pool so that they can avoid inbreeding and making sure that they are choosing the best males. Males set up territory, they choose a location, and then females come and find them. And this very long journey of a bird that's gone from Bath all the way to Norwich, for example, is a female called GA. And she actually sort of threw out the breeding female, did a lot of fighting, and the breeding female disappeared. She ended up actually killing and injuring some of the chicks from that female. And then in subsequent years has actually bred there herself. And so some of you watching may well be representing locations where you've seen this happening. You've seen more and more interaction between female peregrines coming into locations where there are already breeding birds and actually creating quite a lot of mayhem. So there's a lot of competition actually for urban locations. And this is something you may well see more of in Sheffield as well. But anyway, a summary there of just some of the locations from 63 colour-ringed peregrines. And actually, I just want to add that Chris Greenwood, who's going to be talking after me, sent me a few recoveries from the Sheffield birds that do get ringed. A few interesting birds. One of your chicks from Sheffield that was ringed in 2016 was found in Bradford in 2018. Probably the most famous one is one of the chicks from Sheffield that was ringed in 2014. is the breeding male in Wakefield, and during his lifetime in Wakefield has actually fathered 25 chicks, which is brilliant. And another youngster that was hatched in 2018 and has since been seen at the Oldmoor RSPB Reserve. So even around Sheffield, you've got some exciting recoveries starting to happen as people are spotting these colour-ringed birds. A few other interesting recoveries. We had one colour-ringed bird that was actually ringed on in the coast, actually, not an urban bird so much, but this was a coastal Devon bird, and then was spotted actually eating a puffin on Stockholm Island last year. And this bird is an unusual bird. RY was a chick that in 2019 was hatched out in Taunton, and you can see it is a chick in the top left, as a fledged bird in the top right, feeding on a pigeon. And then actually, sadly, you can see it dead here in the bottom two photographs. But if you look at the water bottles there, you'll see that they haven't got English on them. They've actually got Arabic on them, because this bird, very unusually, went all the way to Morocco. Now, this is a very unusual record for a British peregrine, a British ringed peregrine. It was found in Tiznit in Morocco. It had been hit by a car, sadly, 4 or 5 months later. But interesting enough, actually, this journey to Morocco is a more common journey for Scandinavian peregrines. So Scandinavian peregrines that live out on boglands and moorlands in northern Finland and Sweden, Norway, they often will make these journeys. They kind of leapfrog over French and Dutch and Belgian peregrines that tend to overwinter there, and they carry on further south into Spain and France and northern Africa. So a really remarkable recovery. Now, what I want to talk a little bit about now is prey. One thing that really got me into peregrines really was the fact that they ate all sorts of really interesting birds. And I, as a kid, used to collect skulls and feathers. And so I was fascinated by some of the birds that peregrines were eating. And I love this image here. It's a very intimate image of an adult peregrine here feeding its very well grown chick, actually, but it's a very intimate shot from Cheltenham. And here we've got peregrine here feeding its chick in Taunton, for example, both as a very young baby in the bottom picture, as an older chick in the top. And here we've got a peregrine feeding on a swift here. So when I started to realize that peregrines eat lots of different sorts of birds 23 years ago, it's turned into an amazing big 20-year study, basically. And as Rebecca said at the start, I'm actually doing a part-time PhD now at the University of Bristol, looking at this long data set, really, to really get to grips with what peregrines are eating across about 135, 140 urban locations in the UK, from very southern England all the way up into Scotland and also parts of Ireland, and to give a really accurate picture and sample size of what these birds are doing. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But in essence, really, this is the array of feathers we get. We've got all sorts here. We've got woodcock tail feathers, snipe, teal stripy feathers here, and at the top here, a greenfinch wing feather. And both in the past, I've actually visited locations to look for prey, but I also get sent prey. So here, for example, are some prey bags from Exeter. You can see some skulls of some godwits and woodcock, and also a turnwing just here. And what do they eat? Well, as you might imagine, peregrines do eat a lot of pigeons. This is a beautiful, beautiful print here of feral pigeons in the attic by Ferdinand von Wright from 1853, but it just sums up the variety of feral pigeons, actually. And that's exactly what we find with peregrines, that they eat a variety of feral pigeons. And so it's my task very often to try and count how many they've eaten from finding feather remains and things like that. So in an urban location, these can make up about 30 to 40% of the diet, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on the urban location. And perhaps unsurprisingly, starlings also make up a big part of the diet. Now, starlings are a red data species. A lot of them have declined across the UK, but they're still a very common bird in our urban locations. And so they do still feature very highly in the urban peregrine diet, particularly during the breeding season. But here, for example, at this time of the year, just gives you a flavour of the sorts of other prey that birds are eating. There's millions of redwings now coming into the country from Scandinavia, and so peregrines are very good at eating and tapping into this supply of redwings and fieldfares. But also in urban locations, they feed on birds such as teal duck and golden plovers, which you don't find in the middle of urban locations. So we think peregrines are eating these either as these birds are migrating overhead, or the peregrines are going out of town to find them and bring them back into town. And in the southeast of England, particularly around the London area and some of the home county areas, such as Hertfordshire, Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Surrey, peregrines also feed a lot on ringneck parakeets, a sort of feral but naturalized species of parrot that's originally from places such as the Himalaya, which actually live in people's gardens and around the countryside. And I want to show you some footage now of the ways in which there's two ways in which we captured this data about peregrines. Part of it over the last 20 years has been where people actually, and myself, actually find feathers and skulls and prey remains actually below where peregrines perch on buildings. But since COVID and since lockdown, there's been a real opportunity to actually work as a citizen science program and work with both students and adult volunteers to watch peregrine web cameras and to capture information about their behavior, what they're eating, and their incubation duties, and actually pull this information together. And I'd been a little bit skeptical of web camera data until COVID, because I still remember the days when web camera footage was quite grainy and low definition. But actually in the last couple of years, the definition of our cameras has improved vastly to the point that actually we've got prey data now for about 16 locations across the UK, just from people monitoring and watching these nests. So lots of people, and this is Wakefield, for example, where Francis watches these birds, and you may well know Francis. He posts information about what these birds are doing and eating. And this just shows you the task, I guess, me and volunteers have of actually trying to identify this prey. And in this case, the peregrines are bringing in a young starling. So let me just play this for you. So it's quite a noisy piece, but it just shows you here the peregrines bringing in a kind of semi-plucked starling. And so part of my challenge is to actually be able to identify the prey and to be able to log it as accurately as possible. And so I've got a very good eye now over the last 20 years for identifying what these prey are. And what you saw happening there, actually, and this was quite early on when the eggs have just been hatched, was you saw the male coming in and provisioning the female with food. He's bringing food in to keep her in tip-top condition while she's doing the majority of the incubation. He will do some, but she will do the most, and he's brought in that food there for her to go off and feed and keep herself in good condition. The next footage here shows you some older peregrines in Kingston in Surrey, actually, with a ringneck parakeet. And so you can see these are very distinctive birds. They're very green, yellow with long tails, and quite distinctive when you're watching them on this kind of web camera footage. This one's very, very obvious here. You'll see the birds this is in Chichester with a great spotted woodpecker. So in this case, identifying the prey is very, very easy. And of course, the majority of the prey you're seeing coming in will be things such as pigeons and starlings and so forth. So this is in Sheffield, and before I play, I just want to give a big shout out actually to both Alan and Julie, who Alan has been brilliant last year and this year at keeping in touch with me about the prey and prey clips, and Julie particularly this year has been brilliant at also capturing screen grabs and identifying the prey that has been brought into the nest at Sheffield. And it can be tricky at times, particularly depending on the light and the time of the day and things like that. But this just shows you, this is from 17th of May this year, and the bird's bringing in a starling at Sheffield. So this is a juvenile starling being brought into the chicks there. Again, the male bringing it in for the female. And then when the chicks are a bit older, here they have a pigeon being brought in. This has already been quite well plucked. And this is the male here. Again, he's quite dinky. So web cameras have really, really allowed me and team of fantastic volunteers really to monitor what peregrines are actually feeding on. So what I've got now, it is 2 sets of data. I've got this fantastic 23-year worth of data of prey that we found below peregrine sites, from Exeter to Derby, to Glasgow, to parts of Surrey, for example, and London. But then also we've got this wonderful set of sort of 15 to 16 plus locations from last year and this year and a couple of other years that actually really looks at what peregrines are feeding their chicks during the breeding season. And this is important because, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, peregrines are still illegally persecuted. There is still an assumption about what they do and don't eat. And so actually getting this prey data and actually really crunching it and getting a really good idea of what they are eating means that we can actually then talk about peregrines and their behavior and their ecology with real good firm data and science, rather than just assuming what they eat or assuming how they behave. So this is really exciting information and data that over the next year or two I'm crunching and analysing, and then we'll publish so that it can be then shared with the world. This is a peregrine here, just showing you again from a web camera with a pigeon here. So I've been working very closely with Brandon Mack at the University of King's College in London, and Brandon actually has been looking at peregrines from a sort of geographical point of view, looking at the relationship between peregrines and people in the London area and comparing that with rural data. And so Brandon very kindly put together the data from the last couple of years into this wonderful map, which I'm going to zoom in on in a moment to show you. So for example, what we know now from last year and this year from the fabulous data that Julie and Alan have been helping me with is that about 40% of the diet of the peregrines in Sheffield during the breeding season, when the chicks are in the nest, is about 40% feral pigeon. About 30% of that is actually racing pigeons, and then 9% of that are starlings. And then there's the odd other birds that get brought in, such as great tits and goldfinches in that time. Wakefield, you can see, is quite different. So in Wakefield, Francis has been recording about 37% of the diet during the nesting season is actually starling. 25% is feral pigeon and about 8% is chaffinch. So it really is quite variable depending on where you are in the country and what the local prey might well be. If we look at southern England, it's even more different. Take Chichester, for example. 67% of the diet that is brought in, that is fed to the chicks during the breeding season in Chichester, is actually starling. Only 12% is feral pigeon and 9% is swift. In Brighton, 10% of that is common tern. And in London, this is Kingston, about 13% of the diet is ringneck parakeet. And in Andover in Hampshire, 70% of the diet is starling. So you can see that depending on where we are in the country, it really is quite variable. An interesting one up here actually is Cantley in Suffolk, and this is actually a sugar factory, but not close to a village and you know, not that far away from some other urban locations, and there over half the diet is starling. So I hope that just reveals to you that actually by looking at these web cameras, we can get a really good and accurate idea of what peregrines are feeding on and perhaps what the consequences are both for the peregrines and these prey species. One of the things that has really interested me as well with studying urban peregrines has been what happens right now. So we are on November the 11th. Believe it or not, above your heads at the moment, outside, there will be millions of birds migrating over northern England. And over Sheffield tonight, there may well be thousands and thousands of birds migrating at night. There will be redwings, there will be fieldfares, there will be woodcock, there will be dunlin and little grebes and water rails. Lots of birds take advantage of the night skies to migrate at night at this time of the year. And many of these birds will be coming from Scandinavia and also eastern and northern parts of Europe. Now, many of these birds are water birds. They've evolved what we call counter shading, where they've got pale bellies and dark backs, which prepare them very well when they're sitting on water, because from below they look light against the bright sky, and from above they look dark against the dark surface of the water. But of course, we invented lights, artificial lights, and that means that for an urban peregrine, they can spot these birds migrating over our urban locations at night. And so what I helped confirm with the team from Derby Cathedral, and since then other people in London and Taunton and other places, is that peregrines at this time of the year in particular are in fact hunting at night. They're lurking in the shadows of these urban buildings. They're looking up and they're going out only a short distance and catching prey such as woodcock. So, for example, this is in Taunton, where the peregrines have just brought back a very fresh moorhen, a classic example of a bird that will be migrating under the cover of darkness. Here in Taunton, they've brought back a teal duck, for example, under the cover of darkness. And this just shows you, actually, this is at this time of the year, there will be thousands of woodcock, a woodland wading bird that comes here from Russia and Eastern Europe, coming here into the UK. And here you can see actually where the peregrine has actually just caught this woodcock. The woodcock's actually still alive. I'll just show a little bit of the footage just to illustrate to you that the fact that the peregrines are adapting to urban locations. So here's the peregrine coming in panting, and here is the woodcock that literally has just been caught while on migration. So it's really quite remarkable that the peregrines are doing this. And I think it's very much an adaptation from them perhaps being able to do this on moonlit nights. When we look at rural data for peregrines, we do see that there is some nocturnal migrants being eaten, not much, but some. But we do see this nocturnal behavior happening all around the world. In Argentina, in Chile, in Australia, in North America, all across Russia, we see them hunting at night. So it's probably an adaptation to moonlit nights, and they've got very big eyes. They're very well suited to being able to see in these kind of darker conditions. And what we often find the next day are the remains of these birds. So here we've got a woodcock carcass, for example, from Dorchester in Dorset. And peregrines will often cache their prey. So if there's an abundance of prey, then they actually build prey up. Like here, for example, we've got some woodcock here and some teal duck and moorhen. So if we get very windy, rainy or snowy conditions, the birds actually have a store of food that they can come back to if conditions for hunting are not very good. So in summary, really, peregrines have become very good at being able to hunt at night, both taking common birds and perhaps less common birds, but birds which are basically known to migrate at night. And some of these can be quite secretive birds, such as water rail and quail, and even things like corncrake. So during the daytime, on the left here, we've got peregrines hunting at night, where they do stoop diving, and they can stoop dive up to 200 miles an hour at times. But on the right-hand side, at this time of the year in Sheffield and Rotherham, and all across the UK, and also in Washington and New York, for those of you joining us from the States, they will be doing this as well. They'll be hiding in the shadows and then flying out to catch their prey that is migrating over at night. In the last 5 minutes or so, I just want to focus on this peregrine. But before I do, I just summarize this urban prey, actually. So in essence, really, I just want to summarize and just say that you know, looking at what peregrines are eating gives us some really interesting insights into what they're eating. And while it also confirms that they are eating pigeons, it does also give us a really great idea of other things they're eating. The fact that they're not just eating pigeons, that they are very Catholic in their diet. They can feed on all sorts of different species. But the fact that they have adapted to our urban locations by hunting at night, which I think is really remarkable. And I must add also that catching a pigeon is actually pretty difficult to do. If you've ever watched peregrines do it, it's amazing how often they fail. It's amazing how often a pigeon just drops out of the air to evade a peregrine. And actually birds such as wagtails and starlings and woodpeckers are much easier birds to catch. So it does just give us these really fascinating insights into what these birds actually do. And I think the other thing also is that in an urban location, there's a lot of generalist birds, perhaps in quite big abundances. So peregrines are just very good at adapting to this greater abundance of food that is in our urban locations. So to finish off, I just want to introduce you to this bird. Now, those of you who follow the BBC's Spring Watch programme on BBC Two each spring may well remember this story. Back in 2017, we had a license to be able to put a GPS tag on an adult peregrine. So this is a female peregrine. She's been caught under license at the nest to be able to put a tag on. And so she's got a falconry hood on here to keep her calm and quiet. And here Dave Morrison, who came down from Scotland, is putting a very special harness on the bird. And this actually can drop off after a few years or so. It's held on with these Teflon straps, and then will come off after a few years or so. And her name is Sally, and you can see her here on the nest with the tag, and it's got a little solar panel on it. Here she is calling her to her mate. And this tag basically is recording every hour where she is around Salisbury Cathedral in Wiltshire. So this wonderful little nest box here is on Salisbury Cathedral, and this was Sally in 2017 with her mate, who's just brought in some food for her. And she gave us 3 years worth of data. And in 2017, she was breeding. She reared these 2 chicks. One of these chicks actually was an orphaned chick from a rural nest in the Midlands, where sadly the baby's mum and dad had been poisoned. And this very young chick in the middle here, its 2 sisters were put into another nest, and this little boy here was put in with this young boy from Salisbury and reared successfully by the parents here. So Sally the Peregrine reared these chicks in 2017. Then in 2018, her mate disappeared, presumed died, and she still maintained a territory here at Salisbury Cathedral and defended it unusually. There was a rival pair that came in, and she fought with them and defended it. And then in 2019, another rival pair came in and actually fought her, and she lost that, and then she went traveling. So what I'm also doing as part of my PhD is looking at her data. Now, she's the only adult peregrine to ever be GPS tagged in Britain. Some youngsters have been tagged, but not for very long. And so even though she's only sample size 1, the information that we're gleaning from her is at least giving us a little bit of an insight into how urban peregrines might be using both the urban environment, but also the adjacent rural environment as well. So I just want to give you a little bit of a sneak preview, really. We've got about 8,000 different records of her where her position was marked every hour. Most of these are clustered around Salisbury and Wiltshire. Some of this is going up towards Salisbury Plain, which often she went to in August 2017 after she had reared those 2 chicks. And then when she got thrown out, when she got thrown off Salisbury Cathedral in 2019, she went wandering all the way across Salisbury Plain over towards Melksham, then towards Trowbridge, down towards Wincanton, and then hung out near Gillingham and Mere. So this data now I'm actually crunching in a bit more detail, really, to look at this differences and how she was actually using the environment and what habitats, maybe what farmland habitat she was particularly using during these periods of time. And what is also interesting is remembering she's an urban dwelling peregrine, is that often she spent quite a lot of time on the outskirts of Salisbury. But look, can you see these clusters? If you look here, you can see they're clustered along a line, and some of you may have already guessed it, but these clusters where she was perching are pylons. So very often when she wasn't in Salisbury, she was out of town. Some of these dots here are probably where she was flying, but you can see she was also favouring quite a lot of her time perched on pylons, just on the outskirts of Salisbury, which I think is really cool. So just a little sneak preview there of some of the sort of early data from Salisbury, which I'm going to be looking at in more detail. And actually, master's student James Douglas has already looked at some of this data from Cardiff University, and I'm going to be looking at this in a little bit more detail as part of my part-time PhD. So I hope that this evening has given you a really interesting insight really into urban peregrines, and much of what I've told you about can be referred to with the peregrines that you've got around Sheffield, both in terms of birds that will be moving up towards your area, but also in terms of what they're eating and some of these interesting movements that we're starting to see happen. I just want to finish off before we hand over to some questions, and then Chris and Andrew, is in 2014, I had this book published, Urban Peregrines. At the time, it was summarizing everything we knew at the time, and some of this was locked away in journals that may not be so accessible to the general public. So it's written for a general public audience, but it's bringing together everything we do know about urban dwelling peregrines. And if you haven't got it and you'd like to know more about urban dwelling peregrines and more of what I've been talking about tonight, then that's definitely the book for you. And something else that I had come out last year in the autumn was a book about identifying raptor prey remains. And this isn't just for people researching raptors, it's also for those of you that might sometimes find a pool of feathers on your lawn, or if you travel to a nature reserve, you might suddenly find this pool of feathers where a predator's been eating something. And it outlines the first steps of what to be looking for. So it's not trying to be an all-encompassing encyclopedia of identifying bird feathers. There's plenty of resources out there already that do that. What it's doing is trying to help you with the first tips on what you might find, those first clues of what you might find on your lawn or on the path or at a nature reserve. It's helping you to flick through and think, I think it might well be something like this. And then there's other websites that you can look at to really kind of clinch it. So some things there to look at. I hope you've enjoyed this evening, and I'm looking forward to answering some of your questions before we hand over to Chris and his colleague. I'll stop sharing, shall I? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that, Ed. It was truly fascinating. I'm sure everyone else will agree. We have got a few questions that have come in, and if anyone else has any, then feel free to type them in the chat box and I will ask them to Ed. So the first question is, what is the male to female ratio for UK peregrine hatchlings? Yeah,
it's a really good question. I mean, you think it would be sort of 50-50 really, and quite often there's often a lot more females, I think, than male peregrines actually in these clutches. To be accurate about this, you obviously need to look at a big data set, and something I haven't done because I focus more on prey and recoveries is I haven't looked at a big data set really. But anecdotally, I would say that very often there's a bias towards sort of female peregrines very often. Sometimes you get 2 or 3 males, but it's often females, I would say. And what you have to remember is that actually for a bird embryo or a bird egg, not when it's got the shell on, but before it becomes that point to be fertilized, it actually involves 2 sperm, not 1 like in humans. So actually, before a peregrine even becomes fertilized, there's a lot more going at that embryonic stage in terms of chance and probability and what actually has to happen for that chick to become a chick. So, there's some interesting stuff going on at both a molecular level and a sort of a sperm and egg level that perhaps changes, that kind of percentage. But in theory, it should be 50-50. But I always, whenever I'm ringing chicks, it always feels like there's more females than there are males.
Okay, and the next one is, what kind of population density can you have? How much space do they need?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, if you're in rural parts of Scotland and England, they may well be, in Scotland, for example, they might have a territory that's 20 miles square or something like that, big territory. But in our urban locations, both including up in Sheffield and Rotherham, and also down here in the south, for example, you may actually get peregrine nests a couple of kilometres apart. We've had one example in the Avon Gorge where they've literally only been a kilometre apart. I know in Hampshire some peregrines have been very, very close. And actually in Germany, there's a record of 2 peregrine pairs that were 500 metres apart on a power station. And basically the key to it was they just couldn't see each other. So they were quite happy to nest 500 metres from each other as long as they couldn't see each other. So the key to it, though, is resources. It's food. If there's plenty of food around for the birds to be able to catch prey, then they can actually live in quite high, well, reasonably high densities. And I would say around the Bristol and Bath area, where I've done the majority of my research, they're roughly about 2 or 3 kilometres apart from each other.
Fabulous. I suppose you've just answered this in a way, but what are the limiting factors? For example, suitable nesting sites?
Yeah, limiting factors, it's obviously prey, and that's why we're seeing these declines in peregrines in northern England and Scotland, partly because there's declining prey species. Obviously, some of it is illegal persecution and habitat decline. So it's habitat as well, but often habitat related to quality of prey species. But it is also this essence of whether there's a suitable place for them to lay their eggs. So in Salisbury Cathedral, for example, there were many years when they weren't nesting. And we realized it was because there wasn't a big enough nest tray for them with gravel. So they need to have that gravel to be able to lay their nest in, or some sort of substrate that they can scrape into. And that's really important. And often in urban locations where they're not nesting, it's often because there may not actually be somewhere suitable for them to lay their eggs onto.
Great. And do they eat other birds of prey or bats or other mammals?
Yeah, really good question. I didn't go into that tonight just because of time, but yes, they do eat other birds of prey. They do, not very often, but they do sometimes eat sparrowhawks. They occasionally eat kestrels, but not very often at all. They'll sometimes eat owls, such as little owls, and they have been, I mean, basically peregrines will eat anything. But in terms of my 23 years of study, particularly with urban peregrines, the most common raptors they've eaten have been little owl and sparrowhawk. But I could count them on probably one hand. Do you know what I mean? We're talking very, very small numbers here. And in terms of bats, yes. So 99.9% of urban peregrines in Britain anyway, their diet of birds, but they will sometimes eat bats, pipistrelle bats and nocturnal bats. If we head over to mainland Europe, then in Germany and Hungary, nocturnal bats are very important in the diet. Nocturnal bats are our largest bat, certainly in Britain, and they are a migratory bat and occur in very big numbers in these countries. And so they do actually appear in the diet much more often. And if you go to tropical countries in South America, then you will also find bats alongside different species of parrot appearing in much bigger numbers. They will sometimes eat other animals as well. Rural peregrines, for example, along in Pembrokeshire, will sometimes eat small rabbits, for example. But generally, their diet is birds.
Great. This one feeds into it. Would they eat magpies? Apparently, there's a gang of them that bother the peregrines in Sheffield. Would they ever end up as breakfast?
Yeah, they do. They do sometimes eat them. I don't know whether they taste bad or something. I mean, basically, peregrines have a horny tongue, but they do have taste buds at the very base of their tongue, and they seem quite happy to feed their chicks on things like jackdaws and magpies, but they don't seem to often eat them themselves. But they do. I mean, adults will eat magpies and things. And there's been a real influx of jays recently. Some of you may have seen lots of jays in the sky because there's a shortage of acorns this year, so lots of jays are moving around, and so peregrines have taken advantage of that, both in places like Wakefield and Exeter and what have you. So yeah, they do eat magpies, and they do eat them throughout the year, but particularly during the breeding season. If anything, they mainly eat jackdaws, and they mainly eat jackdaws when jackdaw chicks are just starting to fledge and seem to be very easy to catch. And of course, jackdaws will often nest on churches and cathedrals and cliff faces where peregrines are often nesting very close by.
Great. And have you seen any trend from climate change that's affecting peregrine falcons in terms of prey resources, habitats, migration?
Yeah, not really. I think it's hard to measure at the moment of what that might look like. I mean, obviously, I think it's going to be much more related to habitat. So, for example, if we see, less intensive agriculture and changes in agriculture with nature recovery networks and things like that happening, then we may well see. So, for example, like the greenfinch, for example, used to be a very common prey item 20 years ago, and the greenfinch now, mainly because of disease, actually has virtually sort of disappeared from the diet of the peregrine, and that's the same case for things like turtle doves. Turtle doves used to be quite common in the diet of peregrines, and as turtle doves have pretty much disappeared across the British countryside, we've obviously seen them disappear off the diet of the peregrine falcon. So if their numbers recover, then obviously I think they will in the diet. So I would say at the moment it's less about changing climate. But climate could have an effect if it's more to do with the overwinter survival of peregrines. So if we have milder winters, that means peregrines are having to find less food. It means that they're potentially not having to use as much energy to keep warm and having to hunt. And so actually warmer climate may well affect them better that way.
Perfect. A question from Ian. In J.A. Baker's book, The Peregrine and Other Sources, it said that peregrines kill much of their prey upon impact from the force of their collision at speed. Can you tell us more about how peregrines kill their prey and how the peregrines are themselves protected from the force of the collisions?
Yeah, really good question there, Ian. And peregrines hunt in lots of different sorts of ways. I mean, I've shown you the kind of classic way this evening where they fly up and they stoop dive down, but they do all sorts of other things as well. They will sometimes hover over the water to catch birds that are coming up from the water. They will fly very low over reeds and ditches to catch prey by surprise. So they've lots of different ways of catching prey. But you're right. In essence, really, what they don't do is they don't stoop dive at 100 miles an hour, for example, and literally go straight into the prey, because that would be very harmful for the peregrine and could cause it to have injury itself. So they tend to glance their prey, perhaps wind it, surprise it, give it the chance to slow down, and in that moment the peregrines then got the chance to come back and properly kind of catch the prey. Now, that's not to say they don't sometimes just catch prey. If they're flying over a ditch, they may well just grab something, but in essence, when they're doing the stoop diving, that's when they're more likely to glance it and then quickly come back and return for the prey. On their beak, they've got this extra, rather than it just being a hooked smooth beak, they've actually got this extra little tooth. It's an extra little bit of kind of beak that forms like a tooth shape called the tomial tooth, and that helps to lock in between the vertebrae, the neck bones of their prey, and help kill them, dispatch them, basically break the neck. But they don't always do it that effectively. When watching these web cameras, it's amazing how often they've brought in live prey, and Francis at Wakefield has often recorded this, and I think Julie and Alan have at Sheffield as well. So they will sometimes catch prey, but for some reason that stimulus to actually kill it there outright isn't always there for some reason. It takes, which is a bit of a shame, really, obviously, for the prey item, if it's still alive. But very often they do obviously bring the prey back, and you know, they can obviously kill their prey very swiftly when they need to.
Great. And the racing pigeons that they kill, are they actively racing pigeons, or are they ones that are lost?
It's probably a bit of both. We do know that a lot of racing pigeons disappear for a whole manner of reasons, not just predation, but predation is obviously the thing that perhaps we notice and see more of. But it's probably a mixture of both, to be honest. It's very hard to measure, of course, exactly what's going on with these racing pigeons. And actually, you know, you can see groups of racing pigeons flying over urban locations and rural locations, and peregrines flying after them and taking one out, perhaps maybe a weaker bird, or perhaps a bird that's managed to get separated from the flock. But we know from racing pigeon ring recoveries that sometimes the peregrines have taken them in places that have been right away from where that racing bird should have been. You know, the racing pigeon fans have said, well, actually that racing pigeon has been taken well off course. So I suspect it's probably a mix of both. It's probably a mix of some birds being off course, or tired, or disorientated, or just perhaps have become integrated into the local feral pigeon population. Some of them might be just inexperienced racing birds that have got segregated and what have you. Bit of both, I suspect.
And a similar question about swifts. Can you tell us a bit more about swifts as an item of prey? Are they juveniles or inexperienced?
Yeah, so swifts, I mean, you know, swifts in level flight can be flying 60 miles an hour or so. A peregrine can fly at a similar sort of speed, and of course they're both up there in the sky at the same sort of time, in May time. Many of these will be adult birds, and obviously adult birds are long-lived, 25 years, a swift can live till. So it's a mix, to be honest, really. That's the big numbers that we saw in Chichester this year. I think that was because swifts were quite late coming into the country, because there was quite a lot of poor weather in France and Spain. And so I think they came in on a big, broad front. And so obviously on the south coast in Sussex, those peregrines, I think, were able to take advantage of that sudden influx of swifts. But in essence, really, once they're in that open sky, peregrines are quick like hobbies, and they're able to sometimes outwit the swifts and get them. So from seeing them on web cameras, most of them seem to be adult birds. You can tell because a young swift is very scaly, and actually by the time the young swifts are coming out of the nest, the peregrine chicks have already fledged. So generally it tends to be adult swifts that we're seeing coming into the nest.
Great. Jerry says, on my estate there are often dead feral pigeons with just their hearts pecked out. Is that likely to be peregrines?
Probably not peregrine. It's probably something like a sparrowhawk, perhaps. And often you might sometimes see the head removed as well, because if you've ever watched a nature program and you've seen bears in Alaska and northern Canada, and they're feeding on the salmon, they just tend to feed on the brain because that's full of really nutritious fatty acids, and they often leave the flesh. And so it's the same thing often with birds of prey. They will often just feed on the fatty bits like the brain, for example. If you're just finding, though, a pigeon or something where it's just part of it's been eaten, it may well be that the bird of prey has been disturbed, because certainly a sparrowhawk will often come back to the prey to finish it off. But if it's been left, then it's probably been disturbed, I suspect. Interesting enough, urban peregrines don't tend to come down to prey that's been dropped. So they tend to sort of cache their prey up high. And if their prey comes down to the ground, they often won't come down to get it. I think because perhaps they feel too vulnerable, or perhaps they've just got enough prey to catch without having to get it.
Great. Is there any evidence of young peregrines from previous years returning to their nest to help rear that year's chicks?
Yes, absolutely, there are. And we've probably got about half a dozen different accounts of it in Britain, where young peregrines from the year before, often males, most often males, come back and help mum and dad rear the chicks. And we've had it happen twice in Bath. And Hamish Smith, who represents Orkin Owl Trust in Bath, has observed it on the cameras twice there. And in Germany, it's been quite well studied at 9 locations. And we've also got evidence of it in Italy and Canada as well. So it doesn't happen on a big scale, but it happens sometimes. And I think it's becoming more common where male peregrines, young peregrines in their first year, rather than having to battle for a new territory somewhere, they stay with mum and dad, they get some extra food, they learn how to rear the chicks, and then in their second year, they perhaps feel a bit more confident, a bit more experienced to go off and then battle for their own territory.
So interesting. And I think the last question that we've got, unless anybody else wants to ask one, is do the peregrines have any predators?
Very good question. Yes, so peregrines are not necessarily the complete top of the chain, and in some parts of Britain and Europe they will also get eaten by eagle owls and goshawks. So it's in parts of Europe where the peregrine is recovering and the eagle owl is recovering. There's one of those kind of conservation conundrums where you've got eagle owls and peregrines nesting in the same quarry, and the eagle owls are eating the peregrines. And in Germany, eagle owls are also taking over some of those urban locations where the peregrines nest. So you've then got that conundrum, who do you support, the eagle owl or the peregrine falcon? We've seen a little bit of this with eagle owls in Scotland, where we have some naturalized eagle owls, and we do sometimes see it with goshawks as well. So yeah, they do sometimes get nobbled themselves by other bird predators.
Thank you, Ed. And I think that was the last question. So
brilliant, some great questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you everyone so much for asking your questions, really interesting. And thank you so much to Ed for that fascinating presentation. It's been really, really interesting, and we're getting lots of comments now saying thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. And now we're going to pass over to Chris Greenwood and David Wood from the Sheffield Bird Study Group, who are going to give us an update about the Sheffield Peregrines. So I'll pass you over to Chris now.
Have we made David a co-host? Because David's going to go first.
Can David give me a wave, and then I can make him a co-host? I think I have done now.
Yeah. Thank you.
So should I be able to share my screen?
Yes, you should be able to share your screen now, David.
Thanks, Rebecca, and yeah, thanks, Ed, for a great talk. It certainly chimes with a lot of our experiences here in Sheffield. The blurb for the talk said that Sheffield Bird Study Group monitors the Sheffield Peregrines, but it's been rather more than just monitoring them. I've just retired as a professor at the University of Sheffield, and back in 2007 and 8, persuaded the university that it would be a great idea to put up a peregrine nest platform. Those of you from Sheffield and Rotherham area will remember the Tinsley Towers out at Meadowhall that were demolished in 2008. And that was the first site locally that had peregrines on a regular basis. And when those towers were knocked down, the peregrines had already started using St George's Church just by the university fairly regularly, but with the demolition of the towers where they had a failed attempt to breed, they moved to St George's as their sort of full-time base. So in 2011, we actually got a nest platform up on the university. There was quite a lot of concern about planning permission and listed buildings and the rest of it. So the initial compromise was to put a nest platform inside the tower, as one of the photos that Ed showed us had. But the peregrines took no interest in that at all. And the following year, we put a tower on the outside of the tower on the ledge that runs around. And that proved to be the sort of magic dust that meant that they took to it very quickly. So this was the nest platform that the small works team at the university put together for the peregrines, and it shares a lot of those features. So it's got a slight roof. We lined it with gravel and also fitted it with a perching pole there. It's difficult to get a sense of the scale of that, but it's big and heavy. So getting it up to the top of St George's was quite a challenge. But it's proved very successful over the year, and just to show how successful it's been, Ed mentioned this figure as well from the 1961 national census. During this period, sort of, and after that, from that 20-year period, 21-year period, from the 50s through to the 1970s, the Sheffield Bird Study Group, been recording all birds across the 1,200 square kilometres of our recording area. And there were 14 sightings of peregrines during that 21-year period. So that gives us an idea of how very rare peregrines were in the Sheffield area. And that stretches out into the Peak District, across to Rotherham. So it should be prime breeding habitat. Unfortunately, a lot of that prime breeding habitat is around the grouse moors, and as Ed mentioned, a lot of illegal persecution. So their first attempt to breed in kind of recent modern times failed because the nest was robbed, and that pattern continued until 1984, when the first pair was successful for many decades around the Sheffield area. Allport Castles and Sheffield Bird Study Group was very much involved in the wardening of that nest to ensure its success and the nest not being robbed or the adults being disturbed. We, in the Bird Study Group, did a breeding atlas over a 5-year period from 2003 to 2008 that tied into the National Breeding Atlas. And through that survey of the whole of those 1,200 square kilometres of the Sheffield recording area, we found about 8 pairs per year on average, but few of those were in the sort of Peak District, Lady Bower area and the moorlands around there, the grouse moors. But we're far more successful in the quarries, as Ed mentioned, the quarries in the White Peak and other kind of natural surfaces. But at that time, up to 2008, there were no urban nesting peregrines around Sheffield. And it was in 2012 that that nest platform that I showed you previously was first successfully used at St George's, and that's become a fixture and been used ever since. And from 2018, there have been 2 other pairs also successful between Sheffield and Rotherham. So that breeding density, from Sheffield to Rotherham, there are now 3 successful pairs of peregrines. This is just an illustration of how important the urban areas have become to peregrines. These are records submitted to Sheffield Bird Study Group in July 2016 and July 2017, and they show the area there in the red kind of box is the dark peak from Lady Bower Reservoir up through the grouse moors out towards Penistone, Langsett Reservoir, and very, very few records from that area received. But by contrast, Sheffield, 44 records in 2016 and 39 in 2017 is a huge underestimate because they're just constantly present. And similarly, in the Rotherham area is the other stronghold. So yeah, urban peregrines are now far more of a common sight. And most recently, Chesterfield, of course, also has its breeding peregrines now too. So in 2012, when we set up the Nest platform and got a webcam installed the following year, I started running a blog on the peregrines and followed them through breeding seasons each year. And this gives us an idea of how popular it was. So this is 100,000 visitors to the blog. And so yeah, for every year that between 2013 2017, we had well over 100,000 visits to the blog, and managed to kind of just about top 1 million visitors to the site. And it did prove those webcams, as Ed had mentioned again in COVID times, but well before that, they were hugely popular and were getting a huge amount of interest from 138 countries around the world. And as you can see, that's pretty well every continent had people watching the Sheffield webcam following the peregrines. Unsurprisingly, most of those came from the United Kingdom, but a lot of United States and a lot of European nations, there were also a lot of very interested people following the comings and goings of the Sheffield peregrines. Australia as well, some of the Gulf states, I suppose you have to wonder about their motivations for watching them, but it really was a success story in capturing people's imagination. This is just a tabulated summary of the breeding successes from 2012 to 2018 when I stepped back from the project a little. And it was remarkably consistent in terms of the dates of the first egg being laid and hatching and the periods of time between the last eggs being laid and the first eggs to hatch. So around 31, 32 days. And then also remarkably consistent in terms of the amount of time it was then taking the birds to fledge. So from hatching to fledging, typically 70 days on average. And then far left-hand column, we've got the numbers of chicks that fledged in each of those years. So on average, 3 chicks a year was very much the norm. And I'll hand over to Chris now to follow through with that, but just thank you to everybody who's supported the Sheffield Peregrines over the years and made it the success that it has been. That was a photo I took. I spent far too much time at St George's Church watching them and taking photos, and couldn't resist getting one of a falcon sign in the background. I'll probably need to, do I need to stop sharing my screen?
Yeah.
Not that one. Pause share. Stop share.
Wait, I'll try and share mine.
So Chris took over from me in 2018 as running the blog and keeping more of an active eye on things.
I'm struggling to share my screen, so I shall just talk if that's okay with people. So I took over in 2019, which was writing the blog, which was interesting because I was looking forward to my first season, and then all hell broke loose. As Ed mentioned earlier, you get intrusions from other birds, and on the 21st of March in 2019, just as we were expecting eggs to be the first egg to be laid around the sort of typical lay dates, a second larger female appeared and usurped the resident female that we'd had for several years overnight. She was eventually repelled, and then eggs were laid, but in a bit of a disrupted pattern. But then she incubated the eggs, and things had appeared to return to normal. But again, just as we were approaching the time we were, 31, 32 days, we were expecting the first egg to hatch. And intrusions, and there was a bit of a battle royale. A lot of it was off camera, but there was sort of 3 intrusions, and eventually the resident female was usurped from the territory, and we could tell the difference. The new female was ringed, the previous female wasn't, but she was a much bigger bird. She was really big, even for a female, and obviously there's the size difference is noticeable between a male and a female, but this is quite a big bird. A chick did hatch that year, but it only lasted a few hours, and that was the end of the season for that year. But we've got a new pairing now. They did successfully breed in 2020 and 2021, and each year we've successfully fledged 2 chicks, which were all the chicks were colour ringed. I think Dean's one of our ringers who's on the talk tonight. Thank you, Dean. It's always a fun trip up the spiral staircase in the dark and up the ladder to get onto the roof and ring the peregrines. But interestingly, Ed was talking earlier about the split between males and females. When the chicks are ringed, a little bit of some DNA samples are taken, and they get sent off to Dr. Deborah Dawson at the University of Sheffield, and some DNA analysis is done. And we found we've fledged 24 chicks in total from the Sheffield Peregrine project, and the samples weren't taken in the first years, but in later years when we've been Darvik ringing the colour ringing the chicks, the samples have been taken, and of the 16 of the 24 have been sexed, and all bar one of those have been male. PTA, orange colouring PTA in 2018 was the only female we've had. Now, interestingly, as we've had this takeover between the old female and the new large, and we suspect younger as well female, the common factor is our male, so perhaps the gender bias comes from him, but there's a very strong gender bias. Boys and more boys. So it'd be interesting to see what happens next year. But I don't think a bookie would give you very, very good odds on getting a female. It's very much a collaborative project at Sheffield Peregrines. Everyone's a volunteer, and it's people from all walks. David, very modest, but is instrumental in getting the whole project set up. It was very convenient that they chose a university building, that St George's Church is no longer a church and is a university teaching and accommodation building. And so David was made, amongst others, was able to twist the arm of the university to install a platform, and we're really lucky to have it. But Phil, who runs the Twitter feed, works in the estate teams there, and Ian in IT's got people who work in the university and not necessarily in the animal and plant sciences department, which is very well respected in Sheffield, but it's just people across the city who like the birds, and university workers who love the birds, and they contribute to the project, by running the Twitter feed, by making sure the webcams are running well, and Deborah does the the DNA analysis, and we're finding information out from that all the time. So it's fantastic, and we're learning so much, and we've learned so much about peregrines over the recent years, because they're residing in urban areas where we can see them. We can watch them on the webcams, and then we can go and stand in the churchyard and look up and spend a couple of hours on a nice spring evening watching the birds. And if people do want to learn more about urban peregrines, I would recommend Ed's book highly. It's very accessible, packed full of the latest stuff that we found out by watching the birds. You just type Sheffield Peregrines into Google, and our blog will come up. it's interesting. Ed talks about the cameras. We would like to update ours eventually. So there is a fundraising link at the top right of our web page. And if anyone ever wants to contribute a couple of pounds, that's the sort of thing it might go towards. And that's it from me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Chris and David. I don't know if you've seen the comments, but just a lot of people saying thank you so much for all the work on the blog, and people have loved reading it, and it's just fascinating, and that the Sheffield Peregrines really are part of the attraction to Sheffield University for students. So thank you so much. I have got a few other questions come in. Could one of you, David or Chris, post the fundraising link in the chat for people to see?
I'm just doing that now.
Could I just add another point in terms of you commented on the reach of the blog, or Nikki did, from the Wildlife Trust, and it was hugely gratifying to see the reach of the blog. And I think, given the without wanting to kind of tar myself with the same brush, but if you know, Sheffield Bird Study Group and the audience tonight, people attending kind of talks about wildlife tend to be of a certain demographic. And the blog was very, very good, or has been very good at reaching school kids as well. So I know, you know, a lot of teachers would talk to me and say how they would use the webcam and the blog as part of their sort of reward for kids at the end of the day or the end of the week. And I would get sent lots of poems and drawings that kids had done about the peregrines. So it was, the peregrines had proved to be really effective in catching the imagination of kids to engage with wildlife and the kinds of issues that we're facing. So I think the urban peregrines have been fantastic in engaging a whole range of audiences, including less traditional ones as well.
That's fantastic. So thank you so much for that. And the link to the fundraiser is now in the chat if anyone wants to have a look. And I think we've come to the end of the evening now. So just a massive thank you again to Ed for joining us. It's been brilliant to have you with us tonight, and your talk was just fascinating. And thank you so much to David and Chris for joining us too from the Sheffield Bird Study Group. It's been great to have you here, and what you've just said just goes to show how much the people of Sheffield love our peregrines. So thank you for all of your work on that. So, and thank you everyone here for coming and joining in and asking really interesting questions. And we hope to see you again soon. So thank you so much from us, and see you soon. Bye everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.